Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this evening, this dark, rainy evening. On behalf of the U of T Libraries, I'm delighted to welcome you all. My name is Laurel McDonald, and I'm director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. To begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the U of T operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. And today this meeting place is home to many Indigenous and Métis people from across Turtle Island, and we're so grateful for the opportunity to be able to work on it and to meet on it. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming out to the second annual Beyond the Page, the J. Edward Chamberlin lecture. So as many of you may know, this is a lecture that was established by the McLean Foundation in honor of Ted Chamberlin, Professor Emeritus and longtime advocate for Indigenous rights and Indigenous land claims. And we're so honored to have Ted and his wife Lorna Goodison, who came all the way out from the Sunshine Coast, Half Moon Bay, to be with us this evening. So welcome, Ted and Lorna. So thank you. Ted, you look very humble. I'm also very delighted that we have Mark McLean from the McLean Foundation who joined us this evening as well. So thank you so much, Mark, for coming out. And thank you for sponsoring this lecture series. So the purpose of Beyond the Page is to engage Indigenous knowledge keepers, Indigenous artists, and scholars on topics that are au courant, topics of the day. And so this evening, I'm incredibly thrilled and incredibly honored that we have Professor Val Napoleon with us. So many of you might not know this, but I actually have a law degree, and when Ted suggested that Val come and speak with us, I was incredibly intimidated and incredibly afraid because Val is actually a professor and Law Foundation chair in Indigenous Justice and Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. She's actually the co-founder of the JD joint program at the University of Victoria in Indigenous Law Orders and Canadian Common Law. And she's also the founder of the Indigenous Law Research Unit as well. She's Cree from the Saulteau Nation, and she's also adopted into the Gitanyow. Her research covers many areas, including Indigenous justice, Indigenous democracies, Indigenous governance, legal theories, as well as Indigenous feminisms too. And Professor Napoleon currently teaches at the UVic Faculty Law in the area of property law and Indigenous intellectual property law, transsystemically as well. So I'm incredibly honored to have you with us this evening, Professor Napoleon, to speak on a lived riot. So without further ado, Professor Napoleon. So thank you.
This is a stunning place to be able to gather, and you could just feel the magic of the room and all that's around us. I'm so grateful to be here, and Ted, thank you for this invitation, and thank you all for making this happen. Thank you for coming and sharing your time tonight, especially as was said in this rainy and dark weather. So the title of this talk is intended to convey experiences of individual and collective self-definition. So definition as a lived riot, as something that people do together, as something of a bigger life than being buried in what is sometimes bureaucratic and proceduralism, where we draw lines, usually to keep each other out. There are images that you're going to see through this PowerPoint, and I learned a long time ago that people listen better if they have something to look at. So I offer you these images. They're from a little mountain. Most of them are from a little mountain called Picols in Victoria. So should you find your mind wandering, you've got something to catch yourself there. So I'm going to share some examples of self-definition. One is preparing salmon in a city, and another is a community gathering from my community called Pemmican Days. And another is about teaching Cree law through moose hide tanning in northern Alberta. And I'm also going to speak to several approaches to Indigenous law about citizenship and just give you some examples of the work that's being done in that area. So what I won't be talking about is membership, and I won't be talking about the Indian Act. I want to push beyond those confines and so that we can be a little bit creative in how we think about these issues. So, and I just want to note that when we talk about Canada, we don't talk about being a member of Canada. We talk about being a citizen of Canada, and that's what I'm advocating for Indigenous peoples. There's a Kenyan scholar, his name is Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, and he wrote that colonization was accomplished through the control of colonized peoples' tools of self-definition in relation to others, a process that consciously elevated the language of the colonizer by undermining all that comprises a people. There are many, many Indigenous peoples in Canada and the world over who are caught up in what sometimes seems to be a violent web of language, where there's disagreements and issues and conflicts deriving from blood quantum, from biological descent, and from the conflation of identity with citizenship. So how do we move beyond that? How do we move beyond the morass that, in order to reclaim and redefine Indigenous citizenship with its riot of power and beauty and relationships, so that it can be all that it should be? So let's upend the old conversation and start a new conversation, step into some new ground. So my goal is to avoid defining indigeneity in terms of categories or as contra to non-indigeneity. My aim is to take a small step toward reclaiming those tools of self-definition. And so here are 3 instances where Indigenous peoples are using such tools to define themselves and their society. So how to make good salmon, good baked salmon in the city. In his article, excuse me, Caskey Russell draws out the tools of self-definition in Tlingit poet Nora Marks Dowenhauer's poem, How to Make Good Baked Salmon. The poem describes the preparation, cooking, and eating of a salmon in the city. The activity described takes place in an urban kitchen, but the poet goes back and forth in time. She creates a tension between traditional and contemporary modes of preparing salmon. Nora suggests substitutes: fruit cocktail instead of soap berries, the oven instead of a fire, and a frying pan instead of alder steaks. It is a teaching poem, and it is Tlingit in its pattern of language, and it is reminiscent of elders teaching younger generations how things were once done, even as they participated in contemporary aspirations and traditions. Respect for the natural world, an important concept in Tlingit tradition, is seen throughout. Nora writes, gut but make sure you toss to the seagulls and to the ravens, because they are your kin. And make sure you speak to them while you're feeding them. Russell explains that raven is kin. The Tlingits are divided into ravens and eagles in their kinship groupings, and historically, a Tlingit had to marry outside their own grouping. So ravens and eagles are considered kin. Russell points out that Tlingit people would know these concepts from their stories, and this is another tie of the past to the present. Gitanyow expresses the Tlingit value of good conduct. When done, toss the bones to the ravens and seagulls and mosquitoes, but don't throw the salmon in the stream, because salmon have spirits and don't like to see the remains of their kin thrown in by us among them in the stream. Russell explains that the most important passage of the poem leads to the understanding that the individual is connected to something larger than themselves. Nora writes, "Think how good it is that we have good spirits that will bring salmon and oil." This poem is defined as one that is imbued with Tlingit worldviews that are not lost through transition and time, and the understanding that cultures are never static, but ever-changing and transforming, and her work can be read as both tribal and self-defining. Reading the poem in its entirety may give an outsider an idea of how to define a Tlingit person, but the poem is really directed to the self-definition of Tlingit individuals and communities. I heard a CBC interview one time with the wonderful Haisla author, Eden Robinson, and she was asked about how to cook ulukans in the city. Do you know what ulukans are? They're a little candlefish. They're very heavy in oil, and people dry them and preserve them for the winter. And they're a delicacy. So how to cook salmon in the city? What she said was, put them in the oven until the smoke alarm goes off. And then she laughed, and it was just wonderful. Turning now to Pemmican Days. This is from this summer. So I attended this event. It was glorious. There were over 1,200 people attending from multiple communities across Northwest British Columbia. For the past 40 years, Pemmican Days has been and is an annual gathering hosted by my community, Saulteau First Nation. And it brings together peoples who are Daniza, who are from the Athabascan linguistic group, Cree from the Algonquin linguistic group, and Métis, the Michif language, which is primarily French and Cree. And there are non-Indigenous folks. This is my community, and the people you see here are my relatives, they're cousins, siblings, at least one uncle, and nieces and nephews. So I wish and I hope you can get the sense of the vibrancy of this event. It was colorful, it was loud, it was filled with the feasting smells of roasting moose meat and marrow bones, bannock, and there's some bannock at the back of the room, and soups. Additionally, there were concession stands selling cotton candy, French fries, tacos, quesadillas, and all being prepared alongside jewelry and organic frozen popsicles. And to add to the noise and the color, there was a small midway with rides and squealing, laughing children. If you stood in the middle of Pemmican Days on the grounds, you would have heard the non-stop driving beat with a distinctive backbeat buzz of the Daniza hand drums from the Pugisi tent, also called stick gambling, where teams are competing furiously for serious prize money. If you turned your head, you would hear country and western music for the two-step contest, where Indigenous peoples of all ages, all generations, are swinging and stepping smartly around the outdoor stage. A short while later, you would hear the Métis fiddle music, and you would watch the generations kicking and twirling and jigging. In any pauses in between, you would hear the Cree powwow music with the big drum and the distinctive singing. Pemmican Days is filled with wonderful seeming contradictions and odd combinations, like the Cree headdress worn with cowboy boots, the fluorescent green and turquoise loincloth, the beautiful beaded dress worn stylishly with a red fedora, and on it goes. One of my favorite parts is the dry meat cutting contest. But hey, everything is a competition, from tea boiling to bannock making to animal calling to axe throwing to archery to slingshots to leg wrestling, tug of wars, horseshoe throwing, various types of bingo games, and talent shows. There are incredible endurance relay races that combine running and kayaking and cycling and horseback riding. And much of this is going on at the same time. So there's color, and there's dust, and there's music, and there's smoke, and there's grace, and competition, cooperation, love, and movement. For many, we're going to go back one. For many people, they compete in more than one event, inclusive of kids, trans, gender diverse, women, men of all ages. So I have to confess, at one point I was asked what I was going to enter, what I was going to compete in. And I didn't say this out loud, but I was thinking, research, writing, like, it just, it didn't cut it. So anyway, there you go. So many indigenous peoples were part of this. Allies were invited to participate in the race teams. And what is really, really important and interesting are the blurred lines and erasures of ways that we categorize. Cree people participate in the Daniza drumming and the hand games. Cree and Daniza people perform Métis jig and country and western dancing. Everybody joins the two-step. So there's people participating across and with all of the different kinds of cultural events. There's the RCMP that have in the full uniform handing out the $5 per year to treaty Indians, those people who are status and are eligible to receive the treaty money every year. People catch up on births, on deaths, they share joy and on loss. Anyone arriving at Saulteau First Nation with any stereotypical expectations will have a really hard time reconciling their expectations with what they see. In utter defiance of any romanticism and the usual typecasting, there is change, adaptation, pragmatism, and controversy, as well as the normal everyday conflicts that happen when large groups of people get together. For example, in this region, people have decided to include women and in actual practice, trans and gender diverse drummers to play Pugisi. This is controversial because in other parts of Canada, women, and including trans, are still unaccountably forbidden to drum or play Pugisi. Here, the gathering itself is a tool of definition. The music, the games, the dancing, the food, all harken back to tradition and shared history, but they're celebrated in a contemporary fashion. Different communities join together so that communities and individuals are defined by their affiliations, their differences, and their similarities. There's a shared sense of what it means to be Indigenous to many people who are enjoying the social gatherings. The contested aspects point to the difficulty of an all-encompassing Indigenous definition. Societies differ, and even within societies, there are individuals and groups that respond to social and economic and political pressures differently. Turning now to the third example, this is the Wekotowin moose hide tanning and Cree law course. So this is a 4-day course that's been offered every year, and it's taught at Assiniboine-Winniwak, which is a small indigenous Cree community, Cree and Dunizah community in northern Alberta. So among other things, students tan a moose hide. And so in their article, Learning Wekotowin Through Wekotowin, the students' reflections are unexpectedly powerful and beautiful and surprising. The course is limited to 15 students, and it's taught collaboratively by a law professor that has long-standing ties with the community, a lawyer who works with the Wekotowin Law and Governance Lodge, that's at the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta, and importantly, numerous community members. One of the pedagogical premises of this field course is that one way to teach Indigenous laws is through relationships between generations, with the natural world, with knowledgeable teachers and leaders, and through kinship. This was what the amazing late Assiniboine matriarch Adelaide MacDonald, elder and healer, recognized when she said, it was time to start bringing university up to the community, to learn in the community, when her daughter-in-law, Hadley, started her position as a law professor at the University of Alberta. So Adelaide's commitment and insight offered real insight into a public imperative of law, which is that it needs to be part of the world and people need to know the law in order to be able to adhere to it, engage with it, and have it in their world. So that is one of the constitutional legalities of Indigenous law, as with any other law. Today, the course is taught by Adelaide's siblings and children, and many, many grandchildren and great-grandchildren are integral to the whole experience. With Adelaide's vision and leadership, students were invited into the community to tan a moose hide and learn Cree law. So what did those students experience? They began by entering the daily life of the Assiniboine-Winniwak community. The hide tanning takes place along a creek that runs through the community. It's filled and surrounded by children of all ages, from toddlers to tweens to teenagers to young adults, all who ran around and ate and sat and rested and listened and visited and showed off their knowledge and their community, and they helped their older relatives with the hides and the teaching in what is essentially their own backyard. The law students learn about the skilled hunters that brought in the moose, and they learn about the land, and they learn where it was killed. They learn about the expertise and the extremely hard work of skinning the moose for the hide. And they would likely be able to eat some of the moose at their community feasts. Then there's the actual work of tanning the hide, which requires care and skill and patience and strength and really hard work. Students labor alongside community members and teachers, and they engage in conversations about life, about hunting, about the land, the animals, the plants, the weather, the histories, the stories, the families, and the kids. All of it is present. They build relationships through the generosity of the community members, and they learn to think in and because of the relationships. This is part of Wahkohtowin. The hard, fast lines between school and home and student and visitor and teacher and family are dissolved. And they, within this lived and living reality of Wahkohtowin. Cree law is explored within and connected to a framework of moose hide tanning. So what does this reveal about the various tools of individual and collective self-definition? To follow Dauenhower's poem, the Wahkohtowin framework for moose hide tanning includes the structuring of collaborative intergenerational learning and teaching, so there is not only one expert instructor. And we all know that law is an intergenerational conversation. It's an intergenerational enterprise all the time. So the structuring of that intergenerational learning is part of what goes on while people work with their hands in a place that is outside their classroom. So the young are invited to teach what they know while they're also learning. And the learning and teaching is the responsibility of every participant. Further, Assiniboine people are formed by their shared history, and that's part of what defines them, both implicitly and explicitly. Collectively engaging in practices that are central to shared life is another tool for self-definition. The ability to draw the past to meet the challenges of the present is another one of those defining tools. That's the ability to change together. So shared collective memories and stories that are told and retold and interpreted always in today's contexts, that's what informs how a people understand themselves as individuals and as collectives. I want to turn now to Indigenous citizenship. So I'm the director of the Indigenous Law Research Unit, and it's housed at the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria. And we work in partnership with people, Indigenous peoples across the country, on research projects that are the priority of the community, and then the research is owned by those communities. So we've worked with language, we've worked with lands, water, child welfare, governance, so a whole host of ways that people want to rebuild their legal orders and their laws. And so this project is on citizenship. But citizenship is something that all peoples do. So it's if we think about what is it that a people are doing through their citizenship, it's a legal construct. It's a part of how people structure their understandings. And what I don't do here is focus on identity or membership systems, as I said earlier. So really quickly, we have the Secwepemc, and I'm going to give you a little bit more of an example of how citizenship works for these people historically and today. There's the Giksan. The Giksan are matrilineal peoples. You're born into your mother's house, and your father is from a different clan. It's your house group, your matrilineal house group that owns the lands and the fishing sites, and is the political entity that relates to other political entities. So you're born into your mother's house, and if your mother is not Giksan, then there are different laws of citizenship so that you're adopted. The Cree, and so I'm Cree, you're born into families or you're adopted. And Daniza, I'm also Daniza, you're born into families or are brought in and adopted. So people have different ways of structuring relationships and bringing in. And what's important and what becomes visible in looking at all of the ways that different peoples conduct this business is that it's about kin. It's about being kin. So for the Secwepemc project, and the way that all the projects work, is we ask questions of the oral histories and the narratives, the stories. And the asking the questions enables an analysis, a pulling out of the law within the stories. And then that is put together into a law report. So the questions asked of the Secwepemc stories were, how does one become kin? What are the obligations of being kin? And the third question is, what's the legal response when one fails their obligation as kin and you cause harm? How do you respond to that? So those were the questions asked of the stories. And that was compiled there. And then there's a casebook, which is the stories themselves and the analysis, and then a glossary so that the language is accessible and understood. So this is, this project took 7 years. It took longer than the usual 2 years. And it was affirmed at different community meetings and through kitchen table conversations. So this is now a resource that people are working with and will continue to work with. And I share this with you because this whole idea of citizenship and kin is critical to rethinking and reclaiming our own ways of understanding ourselves as people. And it doesn't mean that there's no difference or that people aren't a people. It's just that the scope and the depth and the way of understanding that needs more conversations than I often see in going on in the world around us. So that's one example of one citizenship project, the Secwepemc one. And as I said, we'll be starting to continue this work in January. We'll continue working with the communities on this. So I'm going to shift again in the conversation and just make sure I'm not over time. I'm almost done here. So what does all of this mean? Like, why am I looking at self-definition individually and collectively? And why am I looking at citizenship in the way that we are? I'm advocating for a humane lawfulness so that we can create places for more complex conversations than we're presently seeing in the world around us. There are alarming, and you've all seen this, observations about our societal inability to have basic conversations, especially across difference. And one of the places that the conversations really get tangled up is around citizenship and identity, and that's why I want to push those boundaries out to create more space for exploration, not answers, not solutions, but can we figure out some conversations? So the flattening of the opinions and places where we can have difference, it goes along with attacks on higher education in the name of wokeness, rising authorities, authoritarianism, I should say, increasing economic disparities, and willfully regarding climate change. As Indigenous peoples, we are not immune from any of those things or the dynamics that are carried within those larger factors. And a lot of our own discourse is starting to reflect the narrowness and the flatness of what we see elsewhere. But that's going on while we're still living with the economic disparities that are creating the problems elsewhere. So in looking at all of that, you know, the starting place for me is that the world is the business of Indigenous law. We are restoring, rebuilding, expanding, asking questions about citizenship, which is part of our legal orders, a part of how we take care of each other and relate to the rest of the world. And it's what I hope other peoples in Canada and other Canadians can also have those same kinds of conversations. Everybody should be asking what makes law law, not just Indigenous peoples in the work that we're doing, but those are conversations that should be going on in every household. Similarly with citizenship and how we understand ourselves as peoples. So Indigenous law is in the world. It hasn't gone anywhere, but we're having to restore it, we're having to rebuild it because it has been damaged. One of the things that I've started to do is to ask people to take a moment and reimagine Canada. Imagine that all of the Indigenous legal orders, so law structured on a societal basis, not community by community, are functioning and healthy and doing the business, enabling people to do the business of law. So what would Canada look like with robust, functioning, healthy legal orders? And what kinds of conversations would be possible for that when that happens? So there are lots and lots of really gnarly questions. And I'll just mention a couple here, like what makes a healthy citizenry? What are the kinds of institutional structures that generate, you know, healthy citizens? And what are the, how do we maintain our own individual experiences with connecting them to larger political perspectives? How do we make sure that gender is centered and that gendered violence is factored into how we define law, not as an add-on, similarly with human rights and dignity. So there are lots of questions about what should comprise law, what should it be. Those are conversations that I think that every citizen should have. And I'm going to end there with, may we have complex conversations. So again, not looking for answers, but looking, can we explore together what the different possibilities in our world are? Like that's Canada is multi-juridical. It's far richer than it knows. And there are Indigenous scholars across the country and Indigenous communities and peoples and so on who are doing the hard work of that restoration, like my friend Karen Drake over there. So with that, I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Do you have any questions?
Hello, thank you for the lovely lecture. I think 2 years ago, we had a lecturer, a scholar named Dan J. Burrow come in, and he spoke to us about the concept of radical imagination. And I think that idea is similar to some of the to be different. What do you see or feel?
I love radical imagination. There's a scholar whose name has gone out of my head that works with torture, and one of the things he says is that we live in worlds we imagine exist. And so when we look at that and we look at changes, those changes have happened because of imagination. Somebody imagined those changes, and now they're in the world. And so what I hope is that we all have a bigger imagination, and that we certainly have a bigger legal imagination, so that we're not constrained by assumptions, and that we're not constrained by conservatism or whatever it is that stops us from pushing against the boundaries that exist. So whatever is possible in that bigger imagination, I want to see it as something for all people. Yeah.
Amy, I'll keep it. If I can turn the mic. Just a moment. Just
I hear now. So first of all, wanted to express gratitude for this time with you. I couldn't help but be struck by the contrast between the riotous joy that you were telling us about and the formal conventions of the lecture that we're participating in right now, which is not to cast shade on our friends at the Fisher, because I understand why we're doing it this way, but how might you imagine this encounter being informed by that spirit?
So if we have a new Indigenous Law wing, which has just been celebrated in Victoria, and so it has a large gathering place. It's built on Coast Salish with Coast Salish directives. So there's lots of light and wood, but it also has stories built into it. And the idea is that the building itself teaches. And when I look around here, you have that too, right? It's a different way of a building teaching. It's a different way of people saying, these things are important and we have to take care of them in order that they will continue to live in the world. So there's, if you were by a creekside tanning a moose, it would be a different experience. It would be lovely, and I've had workshops where there was a moose hauled through the middle of the whole thing, and hunters and kids and all kinds of things. So I guess that's a part of it, is having events themselves be like more of a community event. And having kids and different ages of people being able to find a way in and a way to engage in what's going on. We can't do everything at once, but this is important, and then we can do additional things. Yeah.
Was it a live moose?
Yeah, no. Thank goodness. Have any of you ever tanned a moose? Yeah. It's those elders, they are tough, man. Those women, my hands up, they're incredible.
Any other questions? Ted, do you have any questions?
First of all, thank you so much for that lovely talk and exploration and invitation to us all. You've got a rich very complex background as an individual. How do you yourself come into the sort of arena that you're laying out for us? Do you find that richness is invigorating? Do you find it's exhausting? And probably both. Do you find it's helpful? Or how do you manage the very complex and very rich traditions that are you?
So we just had a 2-day launch of the big Secwepemc project. We've been working with different Secwepemc communities for a lot of years. And the launch was, it was with, I don't know, there were about 50 people from different communities. So and this is going on in a lot of different communities, the work. And so the folks, the Secwepemc folks that we're working with talked about their work, and they had them, this was amazing, and I tell you this because there are amazing things that happen at these community meetings. So they had everybody there act out the stories, the Secwepemc stories. So everybody had to have a role, and they had to act out. And to do that, they had to figure out what's that story about. And one of the most wonderful things was younger women who, in one of the stories, is about a young man who doesn't fit in. And he's drawn to the Swan people, and he lives with the Swan people. And eventually they each give him a feather from their breast and from their wing. And then he flies away with them. And when he comes back, he's accepted by his people, but he remains with the Swan people. There's much more to that, much more complexity there. But what those young people said was that this story is about trans. So just think about how the past generations are speaking to the present generations, because the work of every generation is to draw from the past to solve the problems in front of them. And that's what those young people were doing, was looking at this ancient story, which has multiple interpretations, as all stories do. And you could ask it a different question and it'll teach you different things. But I love the fact that there's all of this drama going on. There's all of this careful thought and courage, and people of all ages engaging in that work. It's the best kind of energy, and I tell you, this work with Indigenous law is the best work on the planet. So it's energizing.
Any more questions? Val, are you hopeful that Canadians and the Canadian legal system will ultimately be more inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing and of Indigenous legal leaders?
It's happening on a individual case by individual case with lower courts and different courts, and it's not without its rockiness. There's all kinds of issues involved with that. I think that I'm less concerned with what goes before the courts, and I'm more concerned with ensuring that Indigenous law is lived outside the courts and in the communities. Because if Indigenous peoples are living their own lawfulness, then it doesn't matter what law schools do, and it doesn't matter what courts do, right? People will use them instrumentally as they need to, but the determination for the future and for what happens will happen outside of those institutions.
Jay?
Yeah, I was impressed while you were talking that the larger Canadian, and I'm from the States, societies that are multicultural have many of the same issues. you're talking about, but kind of a procedural question before the arrival of Europeans, or maybe even afterwards. How did different tribes, where their knowledge of relationships were in conflict, resolve those conflicts?
So there's lots of our case law precedent for that. A lot of our stories deal with exactly that question. So law always has promise and failure, right? And when it fails, there's war, and then we have to rebuild ourselves lawfully. And we have stories of that too over time. So, but the majority of the stories are exactly about how we negotiate across legal orders and across difference. And whether it's Dunizah or Cree or Giksan, there are ample precedents to draw on for today's issues. That doesn't mean it's easy. It means that you have some additional resources to draw on to figure out hard issues. You still have to figure out the hard issues. One of the things so all law has to have ways of relating to other law. So our legal orders had that. And one of the tools that I've developed, drawing on the early work of McGill with the transsystemic teaching, is to look at intersocietal framing so that people can draw doctrine from Cree law or Giksan law or Dene law, as well as Canadian law, but then go through and look at whose voices are heard. So you can look at what's going on contextually as well as law to law, and then after an analysis of that, you make a decision. And I've used that in different situations, including mining disputes with people. So, like, law has to do the hard work of law, and that including Indigenous law. So there has to enable people to solve problems, and it has to be legitimate and understood as legitimate, so that when people don't get their own way, they will uphold the decisions. So there's not going to be any one way to do that. Right? It's going to depend on the area of law. It's going to depend on the problem, but there are lots of examples of exactly that taking place. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Val.
And if you are ever up in northeast BC, do drop in on Pemmican Days. It'll just, you can, yeah, it's incredible. You'll have so much fun.
That's like a lot of fun thinking about. So before you leave, first of all, I wanted to thank Val for the wonderful talk. It was amazing. Thank you, Val. We're so honored that you could join us this evening, so thank you so much. I also wanted to thank Ted for envisioning this lovely lecture series, and thank Lorna as well for both coming out all the way from BC along with Val, so we have a lovely BC contingent. So thank you so much, Ted. Before we go I just wanted to introduce two new members of the Fisher team. So we have Rob Mackison, who's a reference librarian. And we also have with us Rachel DeCrushy, who is our new book science librarian as well. And Rachel will be doing a workshop, is it next week, Rachel?
No, third week of November.
So the third week of November, if you want to learn more about book science, please come attend Rachel's workshop. It'll be really educational and amazing, so we encourage you to come out for that. So welcome to Rob and to Rachel. We also wanted to acknowledge Amy Furness, who is the new Victoria University College Chief Librarian. And thank you for asking a question, Amy. But thank you so much for all of you for coming out this evening. And we'll actually close with our wonderful... So Daniel Secord is actually from the Mississauga of the Credit Nation and the Bear Clan. He was to do an opening welcome, but given the weather and the traffic, Daniel will be doing a closing for us. And we're so grateful, Daniel, that you weathered the roads to make it out this evening. So over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Miigwech. Sinanine, Indishnakas, Makwandorim, Mississauga and Dow, Anishinaabe and Dow. Pishiniganing Ashkwasing and Zibing and Donjaba, Minwa Milma, Onjabawan. Nagam1 and Bagana, Nongom Debikat, Manda Shquamon Juding. So I'd like to offer a song in closing. So on behalf of Mississauga Credit First Nation, my name is Daniel Secord, or Sinanine, and to do a closing, I'll offer a few songs. So to say thank you again, Miigwech. Miigwech, away winat muwatge, maba kinawaya, minomaya, bimshko gabuyan. So hopefully everyone has a safe trip back to your homes and have a safe journey. So we say thank you, Miigwech.